Dear colleagues, dear educators from all over the world, welcome again to our 26th webinar hosted by the great International Educational Hub, helping all educators worldwide, one Kwan village. And again, today we have with us a great educator, the outstanding workshop leader, the internationally acclaimed STEM expert and curriculum developer, Mr. Scott Andrew Campbell. Mr. Scott, welcome. Mr. Campbell, welcome.
Thank you, John,
Everyone
for having
is
me
waiting
today.
for this. Thank you for all your sacrifices for the sake of the mission of education. Thank you for being a genuine educator, a genuine missionary, like all attendees today, for the sake mission of education. Since today's presentation, Mr. Campbell, is already quite long, I'm going to forego a long introduction and let the quality of Mr. Campbell's work speak for itself. But for those of you who have attended some of our past webinars with Mr. Campbell, let me just state that his credentials are quite extensive and that he is very accomplished for his age. With that being said, this presentation is not only about STEM education, but also about understanding our entire thought process, from how we perceive education frameworks to how we develop our curriculums and how we manage the business aspect of specialty programs such as STEM education. However, I want to start by asking a question which immediately came across my mind once I read the title, Mr. Campbell. Today, just like me, our educators are shocked by this webinar title, especially coming from an international STEM expert like you. So, if STEM, one of the main pillars and catalyzers of 21st century lifelong learning education, has no future, in that case, the whole education system is in big trouble and our future may be in jeopardy. So why there is no future in STEM, Mr. Campbell?
All right, well, thank you very much, John. First, I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us for this presentation of why there's no future in STEM and what we can do to fix the problem. Now, if you've ever attended any of my other webinars, you might be shocked by the title, "There's no future in STEM," as John has indicated. So you might be asking yourself, why contradict yourself? Why go from talking about ways to develop sustainable and cost-effective STEM programs to then saying that there is no future in STEM? And that's a very valid point. But the answer is actually quite simple. I truly believe in STEM education. However, even great ideas are prone to failure if they're not implemented properly. So this presentation isn't about condemning STEM, but about identifying the problems or obstacles that can seriously compromise the development of quality STEM programs. Issues that, if left unchecked, could be detrimental to the continued development of the STEM framework. So what I really want to do in today's presentation is to critically assess and evaluate the nature of STEM education so that we can develop rigorous academic programs that uphold the guiding principles that STEM was founded upon, to learn from best practices, but also from our own mistakes. And that's really the moral of this presentation. What can we do to fix the problem? But before we can fix any problem, we need to take the time to understand it. And with that in mind, I'd actually like to start by sharing a Chinese proverb. If your plan is for 1 year, plant rice. If your plan is for 10 years, plant trees. And if your plan is for 100 years, educate children. And that's our goal today, to uphold a dream that's been almost 70 years in the making. A dream that is shared amongst many nations, to educate children so that they become more creative, to become critical thinkers, and to pursue a dream that will one day lead their countries towards greatness. So let me start by telling you a true story. It may not seem relevant at first, but I assure you it is. So bear with me for just a moment. So I wanted to start by sharing a story about my sister's success, or a pathway to becoming a successful businesswoman. Now, she graduated summa cum laude in finance and economics from one of the best universities in the country. And after graduation, she applied for a job at the national headquarters of the largest insurance and investment company in the country. Now, it was It was no surprise that when she landed the interview, she got the job and she started a 6-month training program with about 50 other successful applicants who were hired at the same time. However, she was surprised to find out that she was the only person that was hired with a degree in finance and economics. So she asked her hiring manager why the company didn't hire more people with relevant degrees and qualifications. And their response was that they intentionally avoided it. And that might actually come as a surprise to a lot of you. Now, what's the moral of the story? Well, the company knew that everything that the candidates had learned was likely no longer relevant or applicable in the current operational paradigm of the modern finance market. So they needed to retrain the candidates regardless of what prior learning that they already had. So in essence, finance and economic graduates had learned case studies of past events, analyzed multiple hypothetical models, and had the benefits of hindsight when modeling data. Students had also learned about policy and regulations that may no longer be applicable to the current marketplace. And as a result, what the students had learned influenced their decision-making process. And this pre-established conceptual paradigm was often detrimental to the employee's success. Now, what was the cause of this perceptual paradigm? Well, so many graduates had established a paradigm of looking at historical data, analyzing hypothetical alternatives, and analyzing the merits of possible solutions to historical case studies. This resulted in a phenomenon known as paradigm paralysis. And this is a term that was actually coined and popularized by leading economist Joel Baker back in the 1980s. Now, in this context, these individuals were used to looking at historical data in depth and coming up with numerous hypothetical solutions that ended up not being multiple hypothetical solutions that they ended up not being able to act on anything because they were essentially paralyzed by indecisions as they tried to come up with numerous different solutions to the same problem. And then, sorry, with people coming in, it's jumping my PowerPoint a bit. Sorry about that. So as a result, the company knew that these individuals were typically incapable of effectively evaluating the live data. Now, I would like you to keep the story in mind because I am going to come back to this later on in the presentation. But I just wanted to share this idea of paradigms in the corporate world because we do talk about kind of STEM and also careers in STEM and how this transition happens within the STEM educational framework. So let's take a look at our agenda for today's presentation. Now, the first thing that we need to do is to develop a deeper understanding of our own thought process. To do this, we'll need to understand our own paradigms and how these paradigms shape our understandings of how we perceive things, such as the world around us. Next, we need to analyze the true nature of STEM education so that we can go on and evaluate our own educational practices. And then we need to come up with some actionable recommendations to help us start implementing change. So these are the 4 big ideas that I'm going to cover in today's presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Campbell. My next question, do you think our perceptions, guided mainly through our own pre-established paradigms, are destroying the future of STEM? Or are our perceptions the catalyzers that are needed to reinforce STEM and 21st century lifelong learning education? Moreover, if our perceptions are really jeopardizing STEM, how can we eliminate them or at least change them?
Thank you for that question, John. So understanding our own thought process, or the very theory of knowledge and how that affects our own understandings and perceptions, is an incredibly complex concept. And clinical psychologists will spend their entire careers trying to answer these very questions. However, to answer your question without getting into a huge philosophical debate about our perceptions in many ways are almost like emotions. We can let our emotions control us, or we can be in control of our emotions. And the same holds true for our perceptions. Now, developing the self-awareness and discipline that is needed to be in control of our own thought process is incredibly difficult. And we got a glimpse of that in the story that I just shared with you. But this idea also holds true for STEM education as well. Therefore, in a moment, I will continue to illustrate this idea with a number of guided examples that will help us understand the nature of our own thought process. And I'll also support these examples with scientific research as well. And now the big idea here is really to help us to understand the very nature of our own thought process so that we can be in control of our own perceptions. And when that happens, our perceptions will no longer jeopardize or destroy it, as you put it, the development of our STEM programs, but will actually become a positive driving factor for the development of quality STEM programs down the line. So if I had to summarize this idea, people who are enslaved by their pre-established perceptions will never question the nature or validity of knowledge. However, those who question the very nature of their own assumptions will embark in an inquisitive journey of inquiry and critical thinking. And that's the idea that we want to develop and model throughout STEM education. So with that in mind, let's start with big idea number one, which is understanding our own paradigms. Now, while everyone's coffee is still hot, I want to ask you a question. How many of you like a rich, full-bodied coffee? Now, it sounds quite nice, and if you're going to sit through a long presentation, you're probably going to want a good cup of coffee with you. Now, the reason why I asked you this is because I want to give you a real-life example of a paradigm. So there was a large study that was done in the 1970s, and it found that most Americans like a rich, full-bodied coffee. However, the study actually found that in reality, most Americans like a weak, watered-down coffee with lots of cream and sugar. So the study revealed something very interesting. People's perceptions of what they think they want is very often very different from what they actually want in reality. And this discrepancy is shaped by our paradigms. Now, telling somebody that you like a weak, watery coffee with lots of cream and sugar goes against what we believe we should want or what we should like. Whereas telling someone that you like a rich, full-bodied coffee just sounds right. It sounds like what we should say. And most of the time, we're not even aware that we're doing this. It's completely subconscious. And these kind of disassociated responses are shaped by our paradigms. Now, you may be asking me, why is this relevant? Why is this guy talking about coffee in this presentation about STEM education? Well, what I found in STEM education is that the reality of what people think they want and what they actually want are generally two very different things. And this is particularly true of parents and administrators. And I'll go into this idea later on in the presentation. So let me give you some case studies because this phenomenon is not unique. It happens throughout all aspects of life, from business, education, religion, and politics, but the ideas are completely transferable and they'll help us understand the nature of our own assumptions. And that will help us when we move on to critically analyze our perceptions of STEM education. So in the 1970s, Howard Motzkowitz was commissioned by Pepsi to develop the best Pepsi product. Now, when the data came in, it was scattered beyond belief. There was no bell curve, and there was nothing that could be used to indicate what the best product should be. So the recommendations that were made by Motzkowitz were as follows. You cannot make the best Pepsi. Instead, you need to create a series of Pepsi products that would cater to different market segments, even if they didn't know what they wanted yet. Now, this idea was unheard of at the time, so Pepsi actually rejected the findings because it went against everything that their past successes had taught them. It went against their established paradigms. Now, I'd like to fast forward a few years now, and Motzkowitz goes on to take his revelation to Prego, who at the time had limited market share in the United States. Now, his studies for Prego, Motzkowitz experimented with 45 different spaghetti sauce formulations, and he found that people generally fell into three categories. Those who liked plain spaghetti sauce, those who liked chunky spaghetti sauce, and those who liked a spicy spaghetti sauce. Again, this research study revealed that most people did not actually know what they really liked until they were given the opportunity to challenge their own assumptions. And this was because they were caught in a particular paradigm. At this time, most people still believed that they should like a traditional Italian spaghetti sauce because admitting that you like something that isn't authentic just doesn't sound right. However, the reality of the fact is that most Americans' palate is very different than the average Europeans. So again, we see that people's perceptions are very different from the reality, and this discrepancy has been shaped by their paradigms. But before this time, businesses and customers alike were not aware of this phenomenon. As a result, companies were not innovating because they were trapped in this idea of business as usual. And this is how things have always been done. Moreover, customers didn't really know what they liked until they were given the opportunity to explore different product offerings for themselves. And as we saw with Pepsi, they only wanted to look at how to make the best singular Pepsi product rather than looking at ways to innovate. And why was this? Because the obvious solution was different than what they had always done. It went against their established paradigms. And this made them incapable of perceiving the data that was presented to them by Motzkowitz. So what was the result of the study? Well, Prego went on to become the most successful spaghetti sauce company in the continental United States. And this was because they acted on the research that was presented to them, and they tried something no one else had ever done before. Now, in hindsight, the idea of creating different product offerings to cater to different market segments seems incredibly obvious, but this was a new and novel idea at the time. So you might ask, what happened to Pepsi? Well, after witnessing the success of Prego, Pepsi made some changes. And in 1977, they hired John Sully. In 1978, they experimented with new flavors. And in 1980, Pepsi went on to capture the #1 spot in sales in the United States. So it took a while to recognize and understand their mistake, as they were unable to conceptualize the recommendations that were made to them because the data didn't fit into their perceptual paradigm at the time. Now, you might be asking yourself, how is this related to STEM education? Well, as these examples illustrate, most people's perceptions of what they think they want and what they actually want are two very disassociated concepts. And this holds true to our perceptions of STEM education. Moreover, our entire perception of STEM is based on our paradigms. And as we've seen, paradigms can blind us from the truth. Furthermore, we all have very different pre-established paradigms, and that makes it very difficult for us to develop a common language and understanding of STEM education. As a result, we often see that there's a lot of confusion surrounding STEM education, and that is one thing I hope to alleviate by the end of this presentation. So we need to address these issues and to develop some more common language and understandings of STEM education before we move on. But let's talk about what a paradigm is. So let's talk about what this idea of paradigm is, because I keep using this word a lot. Now, according to the dictionary, a paradigm is a pattern or a model, and this doesn't give us a lot of information. But if we look at it in more detail, paradigms essentially establish boundaries, which is what a pattern does. They also go on to tell us how to be successful within the given boundaries of the model. Now, with this in mind, I'd like to quickly review a scientific study by Thomas Kuhn, who researched the effect of paradigms in science. Now, Kuhn made an interesting discovery. In essence, he found that paradigms acted as filters that screened information from the scientists' minds. Information that supported the scientists' perception was easily accepted, while information that conflicted with scientists' perceptions was often ignored. And why was this? Because the data did not match the individual's pre-established paradigms. Now, sometimes the data would be ignored, sometimes it was manipulated to fit within what was expected, and sometimes, and I quote here, the scientists were physiologically incapable of perceiving the unexpected data, and we actually saw this with Pepsi. They were unable to accept the data that was presented to them because it went against their paradigms. Essentially, the board of directors was physiologically incapable of accepting the new data, analyzing it, and drawing conclusions from it, because the data that they were presented did not fit into their existing paradigms. And this happens with STEM education as well. Our paradigms often prevent us from taking the time to stop, analyze, and evaluate our own assumptions. So we become trapped within the established boundaries of our paradigms. We never question the nature of our own thought. And this is important for us to do as teachers, as we need to question the nature of our own knowledge. But more importantly, we need to move beyond a rudimentary knowledge of what STEM is so that we can develop a deeper understanding of the true nature of STEM education by questioning our own assumptions, by challenging our pre-established paradigms. And that brings us to big idea number 2, where I'd like to develop a shared paradigm of STEM education with you.
Really, thank you very much, Mr. Campbell. The approach that you are explaining all this is totally innovative and creative, and it's revolutionary, and it's needed. That's why my question will be now, how can we develop a shared paradigm of STEM education to provide a proper context for critically analyzing our perceptions of what we may assume constitutes STEM education?
Yeah, so far I've warned about the dangers of paradigms, and now I'm saying that we need to develop a shared paradigm. But what we want to do here is to develop a shared understanding of STEM education in which we can develop our discussions on. But more importantly, to build a common framework in which we can use to critically reflect on and analyze our own assumptions. And I want to emphasize those key words again: critically reflect and analyze our own assumptions. After all, in the previous examples, we've seen the dangers that pre-established paradigms can have when people allow their perceptions to control their thought process. Therefore, we need to develop a culture of lifelong learning that will foster inquiry and critical thinking, so that we're constantly questioning the very nature of our own assumptions, to challenge and validate the integrity of our own perceptions. And that's the reason why we want to develop a common perceptual paradigm of STEM education. It isn't to tell you what to think, but to help you think about how you think. Therefore, we want to develop a paradigm of critical thinking and analysis, and not a paradigm of blind acceptance. So let's talk a little bit about STEM. So what is STEM? Now, to answer this question, we need to review our own history. We need to understand where STEM came from and why it's important. So although STEM would not exist as an official acronym for many years, the events that led to its creation are as follows. On October 4th, 1957, Sputnik 1 was launched into space. And this was really the catalyst that sparked the STEM movement nearly 40 years prior to when STEM would officially become an acronym. But it was really these events that set off a space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, while the Soviet Union would initially dominate during the early years of space exploration, and I could cite numerous examples, the United States would eventually surpass the Russian Federation. And this really happened on July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the moon. Now, you can see that it took almost 12 years for the Americans to really catch up and surpass the Russians. Now, innovation in space travel did slow to some extent after that, but we did see it continue. And in 1998, we saw the launch of the first module of the International Space Station, where different nations started collaborating in space for the first time. And you also started to see the idea of STEM taking hold internationally at this point as well. So the impacts that the space race had on education was profound. And you'll see the effects of this point in history resonate for decades to come. Now, the space race of the 1950s and 60s essentially united the country behind a common goal. And this led to the development of excellent vocational and technological education programs, or VTE for short, in the late 1970s and 80s. Now, this timeframe was also marked with the height of corporate R&D in the United States as well, until 1997, when the share of business research started to decline. This was also coupled by the fact that many teachers who were part of this initial wave of educational innovation were also approaching retirement age as well. Now, the VTE programs did continue well into the 1990s, when they did reach their zenith before starting to decline. And this was also about the same time that corporate research in the United States also started to decline as well. Now, these two issues are completely unrelated to one another, but they will have a compounding effect on the US economy, innovation, and on education. As a result, the economy and many VTE programs peaked in the late 1990s. So by the late 90s, many of the VTE programs that schools were offered were starting to stagnate. Teachers were approaching retirement age, and businesses were not conducting as much R&D as they'd done in previous decades. And all of these factors would put into motion a series of events that would have a profound effect on the US economy and subsequently education. By the turn of the century, multiple government reports were indicating that the United States was falling behind in sectors that were critical to the economy. Not to state the obvious, but the fact that students in the US were trailing in these sectors was bad for the economy. And this really illustrates the idea or the goal with STEM education in order to ensure that the nation would continue to be a global leader in innovation. So it really comes down to the need of any country to protect its own economic interests, and more importantly, to protect its own national sovereignty. So in 2001, Judith Ramley formally introduced the acronym that we know today. Now, I would argue that STEM was really just an extension of the VTE programs of the 1970s to 90s. However, there's one big difference. Vocational programs ranged in nature. Some were aligned to the development of job skills for a labor market, while others were geared more towards critical sectors in the economy, such as civil, computer, and electrical engineering. So STEM wasn't all-encompassing of these VTE program offerings, but it was meant to take the best of what these programs had to offer. And this helped to bring aspects of project-based learning into mainstream education. However, by 2005, another report came out which revealed that students in the United States were still falling further behind. So again, we see that America is still falling further and further behind other nations after being a world leader for so many years. And this is not what we wanted to see. And this resulted in a number of criticisms against the STEM educational framework. And in 2008, Georgia Yackman would introduce the STEAM to address a number of perceived shortcomings in STEM education. And I really want to reiterate this notion of perceived shortcomings with STEM. So let's take a look at what's wrong with STEM education. Well, STEM means something very different to a variety of different stakeholder groups. For instance, STEM means one thing to governments, particularly as they look at ways to develop a strong economy, but also as a tool to protect their own national sovereignty. It means something different to industry professionals in the sectors that are critical to the economy. Again, it means something different to school administrators who look at it as a way of boosting student engagement and increasing school enrollment. And this is particularly true of private or international schools, which are not publicly funded. And it means something to K-12 educators who look at STEM as an educational framework. And it also means something very different to corporations, who often look at it as a way to make a lot of money. So we come to one of the more recent problems with STEM education, which is the monopolization of STEM education, which is creating an unsustainable financial model that, if left unchecked, could seriously impact the future of STEM education. Now, you might think that I'm going to say that corporations are evil, or you might already feel that way after seeing your budgets eroded by expensive educational products. But that's not the point that I'm trying to make. These corporations only responded to a need within education, a need that we ourselves have created. And this is partially because teachers were asked to do something without being given the proper support from the beginning. So the problem that we face today was created collectively by society at large. But regardless of how we got to where we are today, let's start looking at ways to solve these problems together. Now, it's widely accepted that the acronym STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I don't think anyone would argue with me on that. It seems that everybody knows what STEM is, but most people don't seem to understand what STEM is based on how much confusion there is surrounding STEM and all of its derivatives. So let me delve into this idea a bit more. Now, I think most people are aware of Bloom's taxonomy, but if you don't, Bloom's taxonomy is a classification of the different levels of thinking or cognition, where knowledge is at the bottom, and as we develop our understandings, we can start applying what we know and eventually synthesize and evaluate the results of our own thought process. And I think this is important for us to stop and think about. Everybody has knowledge of what STEM is, but very few people have a deeper understanding of the true nature of STEM or what it should be. And we as educators know that there's a big difference between knowledge and understanding. Therefore, we need to move beyond the rudimentary knowledge of what STEM is and challenge our own assumptions. But before we do that, let's take a look at some of the criticisms that have been made of the STEM framework over the years. First, I'd like to direct you by some comments that were made by Vince Bertman, who indicated that critical thinking is pinnacle to the successful development of STEM programs. However, other educators didn't think that this was enough. And this led to Georgia Yackman introducing an educational derivative known as STEAM, which I'm sure you're all well aware of. Meanwhile, Ruse believes that we should promote a new structure that also includes the arts and humanities, stating that it is through STEM plus MA progress that we have the chance to become practically wise. Furthermore, Fung goes on to criticize the superficial nature of STEM, indicating that STEM education is only concerned about the project itself while ignoring the concern for the person. And this criticism explains why China has adopted its own interpretation of STEM, which they refer to as STEM plus Sijijiaoyu, which essentially means STEM plus quality moral education. And even the World Economic Forum has called for reform in STEM education, indicating that we should also expand the scope of STEM education to ensure that students learn to evaluate and respond to the social, economic, and political consequences of their work. Now, all of these examples illustrate some very critical views of STEM, which paints a grim outlook for the future of STEM education. And this might lead you to think that there is no future in STEM. But I don't believe that. Now, while these criticisms are valid, they didn't solve the problem. Instead, what has happened is numerous STEM derivatives were created to solve a problem without understanding what caused the problem in the first place. And this has created an incredibly confusing landscape for educators and administrators alike, as there's no longer any common perception or language of what STEM is anymore. So let's look at some of these acronyms. So we have STEM, and we also have STEAM, which adds creativity through the arts. And I think everybody already knows these two acronyms. But we have STEMs, which adds or recognizes the importance of social studies by adding the S at the end of the acronym. We have STEMA, which adds managerial arts and was first proposed by Harvard University. Next, we have eSTEAM, which recognizes the importance of developing English literacy. And as trends indicates, countries with higher English proficiency are more innovative as they have access to a wider breadth of current research materials from a global community. So this idea of including an ESL focus is important to help students in non-English speaking countries develop the skills that they need to access a wider range of research materials. And this leads us to another derivative known as STREAM, which adds reading or research. And finally, we have STEM with a double M, which was created by Dr. Stephen Meyer and Reverend John Gretz, who added the values of Christian missionary to the mandates of STEM education. And this ties in with the idea that the World Economic Forum had, but from a slightly religious standpoint. And this also corresponds to the idea that the Chinese have with STEM plus Suzhi Jiao Yu, or quality moral education. Now, I would argue that these criticisms of STEM are not actually directed at the educational pedagogy of STEM education itself, but address evident shortcomings or failings of poorly designed projects or curricula. So let me summarize everything here for just a moment. All of these comments indicate a lack of creativity, a lack of meaningful connection with the human or social aspects of what we do or why we do it, and that STEM places too much emphasis on the act of doing instead of reaching the desired learning outcomes. But if we look at careers in STEM, which we'll do in just a moment, you'll see that these shortcomings are critical aspects of what these professionals do on a daily basis. And for that reason, I believe that all of these criticisms of STEM education are invalid. Because after all of these criticisms address shortcomings in the development of STEM projects or curricula, which are either inadequate, inappropriate, or completely misrepresent the true nature of STEM education. And that's why I've chosen to continue using the word STEM education instead of STEAM or any other trendier derivative. Because at the end of the day, the development of these derivatives has only served to further complicate matters while adding uncertainty and confusion to our understanding of STEM education. And this has distracted us from solving the problem at hand, which is understanding the true nature of STEM education and ensuring that what we're doing in the classroom, such as designing projects and curricula, actually support the desired learning outcomes. So let's really start thinking about what STEM is and really develop upon our conceptual paradigm of STEM. Because with all the confusion, we may not actually have a deep enough understanding to be able to properly define the true nature of STEM education. But more importantly, for us to be able to use that definition to assess our own teaching practices. So I really like this definition because it's very true to the initial definition of STEM education that was introduced in 2001. So let's read through this definition together. STEM education is an interdisciplinary approach to learning where rigorous academic concepts are coupled with real-world lessons as students apply science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in contexts that make connections between school, community, work, and the global enterprise, enabling the development of STEM literacies and with it, the ability to compete in the new economy. Wow. That definition is very verbose, and it is hard to unpack because it's so dense. So I'm going to highlight a few key words here. Interdisciplinary approach, rigorous academic concepts, real-world lessons, apply science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in context to compete in the new economy. Now, as I've already mentioned, STEM is actually linked to economic growth and national sovereignty. And we can't really forget about this connection because this is really the main driving force at the government level for STEM. But let's try simplifying this definition. STEM solves real-world problems using science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So this is the simplest definition that I can make to define STEM. And I've never had anyone really object to this definition. Now, as I mentioned earlier, paradigms establish boundaries. And these boundaries shape our perceptions. Now, conceptual paradigms are not inherently bad unless they limit our ability to see the obvious. And that's what we need to do right now. Currently, our paradigm, which I've represented by a red box, is incredibly small. And this is really going to limit our understanding of STEM. So we need to add a bit more depth. So let's expand upon our understanding of STEM education and continue this journey of exploring what STEM is. So if our aim is to solve real-world problems, then the problems that we explore should be authentic. By extension, so should our solutions to those problems. And finally, the approach should also be cross-curricular. So let's take a look at some careers in STEM. We have the fields of architecture, biology, computing, engineering, the medical sciences, and horticulture, just to name a few. I should also indicate that although there are thousands of careers in STEM, I'm only able to showcase a select few. Now, at first glance, these fields all look completely different, and you might say that there's no commonality between them. And it never even occurs to most people to even look for a common link between unrelated careers. But this link is critical for us to develop a deeper understanding of what STEM is. Now, if the relationship is not evident to you, don't worry. It's not something that's naturally intuitive, but let me show you Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, you might not see the connection yet, but let me start with the architect. Simply put, an architect designs buildings, but if we delve a bit deeper, we can see that they create a wide array of structures. These structures include homes, schools, and hospitals. But no matter how simple or extravagant these structures are, they provide us with shelter, which is one of the most fundamental human needs. And these needs are not isolated. Everyone in society needs shelter, access to education and healthcare, and places to connect. So architects serve societal needs. Next, the various fields of biology. And this one I think is very germane in our society right now with the outbreak of COVID-19. Researchers and biochemists alike have been sequencing viral mutations, creating vaccines and therapeutic drugs. Meanwhile, biomedical engineers are creating ventilators and other protective equipment to end the pandemic. Therefore, individuals in these fields are solving real-world problems that address the needs of society. And what about the field of computing? Well, while some programmers do make things like games, many are engaged in the development of and maintenance of programs that keep our societies running. Programmers are creating the traffic control systems that change the lights at intersections, the power management systems that control the national grid, and even the software that controls that life support system in the hospital. Moreover, hardware engineers develop new and innovative solutions that make all of this possible. So again, these professionals are solving real-world problems that address the needs of society. And I think at this point, engineering and medical sciences would be self-explanatory, as these professions help to create and maintain a healthy society. So I'm going to jump to the last one, which is horticulture. Now, Yuan Langping is well known as the man who ended hunger. His hybrid strain of rice saved millions of lives during the Great Famine and is now feeding nearly 1/5 of the world's population with less than 9% of the world's total landmass. And this is a prime example of what experts in various STEM fields do for a living. They solve real-world problems that address legitimate needs in our society. And I think that's another important qualifier that we need to add to our definition of STEM education. Careers in STEM address real needs in society and not individual wants or desires. So I'd like you to take a look at these photographs for a moment and decide if both of these would represent a career in STEM. Think about it for a moment. After all, both of these individuals are working in the field of horticulture. Now, what evidence can you provide to support your argument? Now, I'm assuming everyone said that the farmer did not represent a career in STEM, but when I put these photos side by side, it's not clear anymore. Why is one of these a career in STEM and the other isn't? And these kind of murky situations really impact our understanding of STEM education when we don't have a conceptual paradigm that is deep enough to evaluate the true nature of STEM education. Now, the farmer on the right is helping to serve a real need in society. They use a vast array of agricultural technologies to do their job, apply different chemical or organic methods to improve crop yields, and design irrigation solutions. So wouldn't this be a career in STEM? After all, it meets so many of our criteria that we've come up with to define STEM. So let's look at this again. Yuan Langping was an innovator who led change. He didn't grow all the rice that ended the famine. Instead, he created a new strand of rice which others could grow. The farmer, on the other hand, represents either skilled or unskilled labor. They're not leading change or innovation. And this is a key distinction that we need to make. STEM is about leading innovation and not about supporting the development of a general labor market. So what about any of these professional careers? Many people generally associate STEM with hands-on learning and skill development. So skilled professions or professional-looking jobs are often considered to be careers in STEM. And this can often influence our choices as educators when we try planning our curriculum and making classroom activities. So let's take a look at the chef, for instance. Is this STEM, and what evidence do we have to support that argument? Well, we all need to eat, but as we saw in the example of the farmer, a chef is catering to individual wants or desires, not a legitimate need that addresses a societal issue. And for this reason alone, being a chef is not a career in STEM. Next, the sales clerk. And this could be selling insurance or any number of luxury items such as designer clothes, sports cars, etc. But again, these professionals are catering to individual desires and not societal needs. But what about the contractor? They're dealing with structural engineering, electrical systems, plumbing, the works. So if an architect and civil engineer are considered as careers in STEM, shouldn't the contractor be as well? While the contractor has a working knowledge of engineering, they are the skilled labor force that executes the vision of the architect or the engineer. They're not the ones driving innovation. So again, we see this idea of the separation between innovation and skilled or unskilled labor, which needs to factor into our understanding of the true nature of STEM education. So at this point, we should have a very clear definition of STEM, which is easy enough for anyone to understand, and it should have enough depth to critically analyze and evaluate our educational practices. So let's quickly review what we've covered so far. STEM solves real-world problems using science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and should explore authentic problems by developing authentic solutions, using a cross-curricular approach while addressing legitimate needs in society, and should lead innovation through creative problem solving. But I should also emphasize that although numerous hands-on skills are learned in STEM, the focus of STEM education is not about developing skills for a general labor market, but about leading innovation. So if we go back to the criticisms that have been made of STEM, we can see that these arguments are invalid based on our current framework. So let's review each of them one at a time. STEM lacks creativity. STEM omits the humanities. STEM lacks management skills. STEM only focuses on the project itself. STEM does not respond to the social or economic consequences of its work. So as we've seen, STEM is all about creative problem solving and often requires us to look at problems from a different perspective. So STEM does involve creativity and critical thinking. STEM also is centered around the humanities, and we can see this by the focus of solving real-world problems that are centered around societal needs. And our curriculum design in STEM should also mimic this reality as well. The fact that STEM lacks management skills is also a misnomer, as STEM is all about leading innovation. And this requires students to learn about project management, collaboration, and communication skills as well. So we see that STEM should cover these skill sets if it's being done properly. The fact that there's a growing number of people that saying that STEM only focuses on the project is a concerning trend for me. And part of this is because of the number of do-it-yourself kits that are being sold under the guise of STEM education. Now, there's nothing wrong with do-it-yourself kits or the companies that sell them, but these do-it-yourself kits often do not uphold the ideology of STEM education. However, the use of these kits is growing in STEM education, and this is being driven by the amount of confusion surrounding STEM education and a lack of support being given to educators who've been thrown into a program without any training or support. And finally, that STEM does not consider the social impacts of innovation. Again, that is completely inaccurate. Look at the development of the hybrid rice strain by Yuan Lanping, or the study of renewable energy. Look at the development of all the technologies that we use every day, which improve our lives. And then think about how all of these innovations have impacted the societal and economic well-being of our societies. So again, that is why I've decided to continue using the acronym STEM, because at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with STEM in its purest form. And that brings us to big idea number 3. At this point, I'd like to provide you with some classroom examples to apply our current understanding of STEM education.
Thank you very much. Again, very detailed and very innovative frameworks that you are presenting here, Mr. Campbell, and I'm sure that all educators will benefit from it. My question here is, how can STEM education be used to positively affect establishment of 21st century student-centered mindset of lifelong learning? Furthermore, does it really help scholars to exceed the expected curricular standards and learning outcomes?
Yeah, sorry, I was just reading some of the questions in the chat there. Yeah, so getting back to your question, it absolutely does. As we saw with the original definition of for STEM education, the goal was to create real-world lessons that apply science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in context. And this really shows the students the reasons why they're learning these concepts in their core subject areas, which helps create an authentic context that demonstrates how these concepts can be used in the real world, which will help your students understand where these ideas can take them. And this provides clarity as the students can begin to visualize their future career paths and what type of lifelong learning that's going to be associated with that journey. But in order for us to make that kind of impact, we need to make sure that the learning opportunities that we offer our students are meaningful, authentic, and academically stimulating. Therefore, we need to ensure that our projects uphold rigorous academic standards that will help prepare our students for the new economy, which is one of the prime directives of STEM education. So building on this idea, we'll review several STEM projects, evaluate them based on grade level expectations, and then we'll look at ways to ensure that we're achieving desirable learning outcomes that not only meet, but also exceed expected curricular standards. And we'll do this by creating well-defined learning outcomes for each and every project that we design. So here's a bunch of projects from a grade 11 program that I worked with a few years ago. Now, if our goal is to create rigorous academic programs that will foster innovation in key economic sectors, and this is what we're doing in a grade 11 program, then we have a problem. And the school also thought so as well. Therefore, I started going through these projects and I did see some potential. So let's focus on this drone project in a little bit more detail. So we did redesign this project, but this approach of using a 3D doodle pen, that had to go. So the original project design, there was no math, there was no science, and there was no real use of technology either. Everything was just focused on the act of making a drone. It was completely reactive in nature, where STEM should apply the engineering and design process, which is a well-planned and methodical approach to design. So what we ended up starting with is this. Here you can see that these students started using specialized equipment such as calipers to take precise measurements. Then they went on to make a rough draft of the design using paper and pencil before reviewing it, critiquing it, and then revising it. Finally, students then digitized their designs using a CAD program so that they could print their designs using a 3D printer. Now, you might say that this looks great, but as I mentioned before, STEM should solve real-world problems. So you might be asking, how does this drone project, how does this address a legitimate need in society? Well, not that long ago, we had a major flood in Hunan province, and China had an interesting solution that they'd been developing prior to this natural disaster. And they were able to deploy this new technology for the first time. And it was actually an automated drone that could restore 5G cell service to a 50 square kilometer area for up to 5 hours. And this one drone was able to help rescue crews find, locate, and save thousands of people in the aftermath of the flood. So the idea of drone development actually solves real-world problems. So although the initial project design that used a 3D doodle pen was poorly executed, there was value in the idea. The teacher just needed help to redefine that idea and to develop the project into a more meaningful way. So after redesigning the project, students were shown how to properly apply the engineering and design process in an authentic way while using specialized equipment such as calipers to take precise measurements, which they would then use when creating their drones. They created designs on paper, analyzed their ideas with their peers in a formal critique process, and revised their designs before digitizing these designs using a CAD program so that they could use technologies such as 3D printers in an authentic way to support the desired learning outcomes. And finally, they created a high-quality product that upholds the ideas of STEM education. Now, here's a quick video of one of the student projects. While it did use pre-made circuits, the drone itself was created by the student. Now, what about this STEM project here? Now, what grade level do you think this project is for? What about now? This was actually a grade 12 honors chemistry project where the students were learning about creating water-resistant paints. Now, you might be thinking, just as I am right now, that this activity isn't appropriate for that grade level. But the school was proud of the results because they thought that this was a good example of STEM education because the students had engaged in project-based learning. Now, here are some images from that post, and you see that these grade 12 students are in a well-equipped chemistry lab, creating paints using craft glue and ground-up colored chalk. But we're probably asking ourselves, where is the real chemistry? And again, this comes down to the idea of throwing teachers into STEM without the necessary training or support needed. After all, designing authentic STEM lessons is incredibly difficult, especially if teachers have never worked in industry before. Now, I should state that this teacher was an amazing chemistry teacher when it came to teaching theoretical concepts, but they had limited understanding of how science would be applied to solve real-world problems in industry. Now, there's so many ways that we could have made this project more appropriate for grade 12 students, and I'm going to go over those in just a moment. So here I have some examples of what we could have done instead. To the left, I have reference to how we could look at different chemical compounds that would allow for a thermochromatic effect to be explored. That is when the color of something changes due to temperature as a result of a reversible chemical reaction. Next, on the right, I have an example of how you could create ferric oxide to create a colored pigment. Now, for reference, ferric oxide is used to create compounds such as blush and makeup. So we already have a few options that we could use to improve this one project. But let's take this idea a little bit further. Now that we have pigments, we can then explore different chemical methods to convert this pigment into a usable paint. First, we could look at how to use different chemical solutions to create binding agents and solvents. Or second, we could look at our past to learn how some of the greatest minds of our time created masterpieces such as the 16th Chapel. At this time, paints were made using pigments such as ferric oxide and lapis lazuli, which were ground into fine powders. These pigments were then mixed with egg whites, which created a molecularly stable organic compound that could last for centuries. And in all honesty, these methods were actually chemically superior to our current manufacturing processes in many ways. So this one project could easily be redesigned in a way that would make it much more meaningful. So what about this project? Again, it's another social media post, this time for a grade 12 calculus project. Now, this post indicated that the students were exploring the velocity of a marble using calculus, but realistically, the math and the project are somewhat disassociated from one another. You don't really need to do the math to do the project, and you don't need to do the project to do the math. These two aspects of the project are loosely correlated. So is this STEM? And I've also seen roller coaster projects being used at a number of different grade levels, which raises some serious questions. Are we developing projects that are age appropriate? And this kind of disconnect between the desired learning outcomes and the project design is causing a lot of problems in STEM education. Now, here we have a website promoting this activity, and I'm not disputing the quality of the website or the resource or the validity of the project itself. But what I want to draw your attention to is something up here in the corner. If we look at this, it says or indicates arts and crafts, hands-on fun. And that's how this project is being described. But when we look at the driving forces which led to the creation of STEM, it was really meant to meet the needs of critical sectors in the economy. STEM was never created to ensure STEM was created to ensure continued economic prosperity of the nation. And this plays a pivotal role in protecting our national sovereignty. It was never to create hands-on activities so that students could have fun in class. So how did we get here? How did STEM deviate so far from its initial mission statement? And when we look at some of these books, such as STEAM Creations and book-inspired STEAM activities for kids, and again, I'm not criticizing the book or the author, but I want you to take a look at these examples of what people are starting to call STEM or STEAM education. And if you look here, it says craft brain. These are all representative of arts and crafts. Now, STEAM was supposed to fix the problems that we talked about earlier in this presentation. However, these examples do not address the issues of student proficiency in critical sectors to the economy. while also not helping students to understand how to solve real-world problems using authentic cross-curricular approaches, while also only focusing on the project itself, while failing to address the human, social, or economic impacts that are related to the project. And when we look at this list of shortcomings, they represent all of the issues that were made of the original STEM education framework. So it's very clear that STEAM didn't solve the problem. It actually made it worse. So how did we get here? How did we get to the point of rigorous academic programs becoming nothing more than arts and craft projects throughout all grade levels? So to understand how we got to where we are today, we need to understand a number of cause and effect relationships that are happening within our society. We need to understand our own history. So as I said, the space race of the 1950s through 1960s acted as a catalyst that galvanized all aspects of our society, specifically in America. And it ushered in an era of unprecedented collaboration between governments, industry, and the educational sector, which led to the development of high-quality VTE programs in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. However, by the late 1990s, many of the educators who were part of this golden age of collaboration were approaching retirement age, and this in turn led to the stagnation of these programs. Moreover, by the year 2000, it was evident that the economy was lagging in key sectors to the economy. Therefore, STEM was introduced to address the issues of student proficiency in these key areas. However, a critical issue was overlooked. And this was that the root cause of these problems were never identified. We were quick to determine that student proficiency was trailing in areas that are critical to the economy, but we never stopped to ask why this was happening. So let me explain. The late 1990s onwards saw a lot of experienced technology teachers leave the profession due to old age and retirement. Meanwhile, the introduction of STEM education in 2001 created a huge demand for qualified teachers, and this shortage was only exacerbated by the effect of numerous teachers simultaneously leaving the profession. Moreover, while demand for teachers outpaced the supply of quality teachers, appropriate actions were not taken to address the issue of teacher shortages in these key sectors. As a result, new teachers were often asked to teach STEM with little support, training, or guidance. And as we saw in the report, rising above the gathering storm, we didn't achieve our initial goals with the development of STEM education. And the situation only got worse with time. And that led to the development of numerous STEM derivatives. However, as we are starting to see, these derivatives, such as STEAM, didn't address the root cause of this problem. And in reality, they only serve to further complicate matters and make things worse. So STEM was introduced to address a massive need in our society, and we see this burden being placed on teachers by local governments. However, any of the teachers in the audience will know teachers are seldomly given the support, guidance, or resources that they need to fulfill these kinds of requests. Moreover, unlike what we saw happen in the 1950s and 60s, our current situation doesn't have a galvanizing catalyst to help foster collaboration between these sectors, government, industry, and education. As a result, anything that involved hands-on approaches to teaching and learning started getting branded as STEM education, as the simplistic or superficial understanding of began to take hold. Furthermore, as a result of all the confusion surrounding the development of STEM education, corporations started capitalizing on the business opportunities that were growing in the educational sector. And while some companies created completely new educational resources, other companies simply rebranded existing products to capitalize on a market that was ripe for the taking. And that brings me to my next topic.
That's why, thank you very much again, Mr. Campbell, for this in-depth analysis of STEM and of STEAM, STEM all, I mean, progressive analysis. That's why my question will be now, officially, STEM was launched at the end of the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century. After 2 decades, can we state today that STEM education established a new pillar and the appropriate roadmap to create and produce a 21st century sustainable lifelong learning education and help reinforce the sustainability factor to make sure that our students are apt for today and ready for tomorrow's challenges?
That's a great question. And as we've seen, STEM education was introduced to revolutionize education and to spur innovation by having students develop rigorous academics that apply concepts prior to attending specialized university programs, which would better prepare students for a competitive global economy. Moreover, this would also help strengthen and improve the long-term sustainability of the economy. However, this would require the educational sector to develop curricula that applies complex concepts in an authentic way, while also developing a sustainable educational model. And the only way to really do this is to identify the desired learning outcomes and then design a program of study around transferable concepts that can transcend the test of time. However, the rush to develop programs has often resulted in technology purchases being made in haste. And this results in the learning outcomes being shaped around how to use a specific piece of technology instead of the authentic use of that technology. And that kind of coincides with one of the comments here about 3D printers that one of the audience members has made. And I'll come back to that question later on in the presentation as well. But getting back to answering your question, so basically, the advent of STEM education did see thousands of products come to market, which enabled teachers to easily introduce hands-on learning into the classroom. However, many of these products focus solely on the act of making a project and often fail to address key learning outcomes in the process. And as we saw earlier, this was a large contributing factor that led to many of the criticisms against STEM in the first place. So if we want to prepare students for the world of tomorrow, we need to act today. We need to focus on developing authentic programs of study that are designed around sound educational principles. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to show you some examples of STEM education programs from 30 years ago in the hopes of showing you that quality curriculum development can withstand the test of time. Therefore, if we look past the fads, we can develop sustainable programs of study that are fiscally more responsible as they maximize the life cycle of equipment that is necessary to run the program, which increases the return on investment while also simultaneously developing more sustainability in the curriculum. And this will allow for those rigorous academic standards to be developed over time. So with that being said, I want to talk about this idea of fads versus enduring knowledge. So this school is showcasing one of their new STEM products, and it's a racetrack for CO2 dragsters. And this is a project that I personally really like. And it's also one of the best-selling project kits from companies such as High Genius in Hong Kong and Pitsco out of the United States. Well, and this has actually been one of the best-selling STEM projects, but it's been around for quite a few years. And in all honesty, this one product has actually been sold in the United States now for close to 70 years now. For example, here we have the Pitsco Guide to Education from the 1990s that I used as a student when I studied technology. But CO2 racers were popular way before then. In these final examples, you can see some of the do-it-yourself kits from the mid-1950s. These kits were popular activities at the time as they helped kids get interested in aerodynamics and propulsion during the US-Soviet space race. Now, although this was a little bit before my time, my father's generation would build these rocket-propelled cars and race them in large tournaments, some of which were even held at the semi-national levels. And so here we have a STEM product that's been around for 70 years, well beyond the lifespan of STEM education, which was introduced in 2001. Now, we can see the influence of this idea of rocket-propelled vehicles as a major driving force in society, even to this day, from the development of the fastest land-based vehicle, which was essentially a rocket on wheels, to our modern-day maglev technologies. All of these advancements came from the study of propulsion and aerodynamics. Now, the idea of rocket propulsion and aerodynamics, which are all covered in the design of the CO2 racers, are ideas that can transcend time. And although some of the methods that we use or take will vary over time, the core learning objectives, that is the curriculum at the heart of the project, that has remained the same. And I think that's an important thing to consider when developing sustainable STEM programs. We need to look at the learning outcomes and not be distracted by new fads or technology. So with that in mind, I want to show you some examples of what our technology programs look like in the 1990s, just to illustrate this point. Here we have examples of this project being done in 1993. Again, this is before STEM even existed, but you can really see the cross-curricular nature the programs had back then. Not only did the students design, build, and test their racers, they also dealt with the logistics of setting up tournaments, broadcasting, and providing live commentary of the events. Now, fast forward 30 years, I wanted to start a broadcasting program at my school. So I pulled out all of my old camera equipment from storage. Now, many of these cameras were purchased when I started my first company back in 2002. So we're not using state-of-the-art equipment. However, all of the schools that attended this championship tournament were amazed at how sophisticated our setup was. Everyone commented that they had never seen anything like this before. And this really shocked me. Think about it. How did we digress so far? And why is it that I'm constantly looking to our past to find inspiration for our future, particularly in the fields of science and technology? So again, sorry, my PPT is jumping around there. So again, I want to take you back to a classroom project from the mid-1990s. Now, this was an amazing aviation project that my teacher, John Perkins, designed in collaboration with an aerospace engineer. Now, we spent the entire term learning the math and science of aviation, manufacturing techniques, electronics and control systems, and at the end of the day, we built a scale model that we actually flew out of the local airport. And this is a great example of what an interdisciplinary approach to real-world lessons, which offers rigorous academic concepts, would look like. And that is what the government was looking for when Judith Ramley introduced the term STEM back in 2001. So when I started developing aviation projects for STEM programs here in China, I did exactly what John did 30 years ago. I reached out to industry professionals and I started working with an aerospace engineer from the Nanjing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And this really helped me as a teacher to design scaffolded projects that would make introducing aviation into a high school program a viable reality. But we don't see this kind of collaboration happening anymore between governments, industry professionals, and teachers. And this has really been to the detriment of STEM education. Now, as I've mentioned before, STEM should be solving real-world problems. So you might be thinking, how does the study of aviation address real-world problems? Well, I recently came across this news story on CNN, which illustrates this idea perfectly. Johan wanted to know if his life choices were having a positive effect on addressing climate change, so he contacted CNN for help. Now, Jonas has a very healthy lifestyle. He eats mostly vegetables, rides his bike everywhere, and has installed solar panels on his roof. Now, based on all of these factors, his carbon footprint is about 40% less than the average American. However, there's one choice that he makes that negates all of these other choices. Every year, Johan returns to the Netherlands to visit his family. As we can see in this example, all of these choices that he as an individual can make are dwarfed in comparison to the one thing that's out of his control, the emissions from commercial aviation. And so this idea of researching aerodynamics has and will continue to be important for years to come. And that leads me to my next example. So while do-it-yourself kits provide educators with easy, ready-made projects that can be implemented with little to no preparation, these kits tend to offer very little towards achieving the desired learning outcomes of established curriculums. However, rocketry has so many wonderful grade level extensions for senior school students. Drawing inspiration from my experiences from the late 1990s, I can speak to the scientific value that model rockets can have. Take this for example. Here's a balanced chemical reaction for a combustion-based reaction. Now, if you're not overly familiar with chemistry, let me explain what's happening here. First, we have potassium nitrate, or household fertilizer, and this is mixed with regular table sugar. As long as this chemical mixture does not come in contact with a flame, it's relatively stable. However, it is capable of creating a powerful combustion-based chemical reaction that will create a large amount of thrust. This reaction will result in the formation of an inorganic compound and carbon dioxide, as well as water. Now, as an instructor, I wouldn't give my student the balanced chemical equation. Instead, I would start by reviewing how to balance the chemical equation and then have my students balance this equation on their own before checking their work and moving on. Then, in order to create the most efficient rocket fuel, students would need to determine the molar mass of each compound so that they could determine the correct ratio of each. With all the math done, they would then be ready to move on and create their own rocket fuel. Now, as it stands, this project would have them apply chemistry in an authentic way. However, it still wouldn't have the students apply the scientific method, and I have a perfect way to do that. So what would happen if we added aluminum to the mix? Would it improve your rocket's performance? And what evidence could you use to support your claim? Now, in this case, students would need to formulate a hypothesis that we could then go on and test. Now, in theory, adding something that is not necessary to balance the chemical reaction isn't recommended. However, adding aluminum to rocket fuel is an exception to that rule. Let me tell you a little bit more about this phenomenon. In the early 1950s, Kenneth Rumble and Charles Henderson conducted a series of experiments where they added aluminum to conventional rocket fuels. The results of their experiments indicated a dramatic increase in the exit velocity of combustion-based gases. So much so that this brought solid fuel rockets into similar performance levels as liquid fuels like kerosene and liquid oxygen. Due to the research in chemical propulsion methods, the US Navy was actually able to significantly increase the range of ballistic missiles and orbital rockets. Now, because this was a bit of a trick scenario, almost every student's hypothesis will be disproven in this case. However, this will give them a great opportunity to conduct some internet research. And students should be able to find the answers to this question, as the initial research has been declassified and can be easily found on the internet. But what about testing such a hypothesis? Well, in the 90s, we had to use analog test equipment. However, we can now use digital force meters, which opens up a world of possibilities. We can now easily record and export data from our experiments directly to the computer, which is great for collecting data. So it's actually even easier to do this kind of experiment now than it was 30 years ago. And here you can see what a simple setup for testing homemade rocket engines would look like in this photo. And finally, if your school has a metal shop, which mine did, you can even manufacture your own rocket engines using a small metal lathe. So as you can see from this example, when you develop a fully cross-curricular approach to teaching and learning, your projects will last longer, which will also lower the hourly cost of instruction. Moreover, they will go much deeper into the core curriculum, and that type of in-depth inquiry-based exploration, that's what's going to make students more competitive in the new global economy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Campbell. My next question will be, and I remind everyone that in about 15, 20 minutes, we're going to be done, and Mr. Campbell is going to answer all your questions in the box. And of course, you can ask your questions live too at the end of this webinar, in about 20 minutes. Can we say today that business entities played a significant role in supporting educators and public education authorities to overcome the different challenges and constraints to establishing a robust STEM education learning environment, or their role has no weight at all?
That's an amazing question, and I don't really have a simple answer to that question. But as I mentioned before, without a galvanizing force to bring governments, industry, and educators together, teachers were essentially asked to do the impossible. And that's where corporations came to the rescue. Teachers were crying out for support, resources, and materials. And companies were all too happy to start supplying products to fill this need. But that also gave them an opportunity to start directing the narrative as well, which would give them the power to monopolize on what was unfolding in the educational sector. But I'd like to build on this idea a bit more before moving on. Early in the presentation, I discussed that different stakeholder groups had different understandings of what STEM education meant to them, and that these ideas have diverged as time has gone on. And although it seems unrelated, geopolitics is actually having a pronounced impact on the global state of education, STEM education. We used to have a lot more government support to build programs that would help students develop the skills that they need needed to support critical sectors in the economy. And this in turn would help the nation become more innovative and competitive, which would continually drive more R&D. And finally, access to high quality talent pool that truly understood the real world applications of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics would make the entire industry more innovative, which would help to strengthen the economy and ensure that the entire country would continually become wealthier over time. And the generation of wealth from private sector would in turn benefit the government. So we had a synergy at one point where all stakeholder groups were united in a common goal that ensured everybody came out a winner. Unfortunately, times have changed. The wheel of collaboration is broken, and as a result, educators have been forced to navigate a very challenging political landscape on top of their role as educators. And this is a result of the turbulent times that we live in, as most political systems now stand divided on most issues. Therefore, as a result of bipartisan politics, most governments are now too preoccupied with maintaining a functional government that they're unable to support collaborative endeavors with the educational sector to build quality STEM programs. Moreover, cuts to educational spending has become the norm in most countries. So again, we see additional burdens being placed on teachers to do more with less and without much external support. Therefore, teachers and school administrators are always looking at ways to stretch their budgets as far as they can, as far as possible, and make sure that their limiting funding will last, that they can do as much with that funding as possible. To build sustainable programs that will maximize the return on investment while extending the usable life cycle of equipment is definitely paramount. However, corporations are looking at ways of maximizing profits, which is the exact opposite of looking for ways to lower the total cost of instruction. Therefore, easy to use, Highly marketable products that have short life cycles due to planned obsolescence are key to maintaining revenue streams in the private sector, which brings me back to the recommendations of trying to look beyond the fads that we just finished talking about. Now, Lego is a company that's done a great job of monopolizing the educational market. And don't get me wrong, this is actually one of my favorite companies. And I highly recommend their products, while also issuing a word of caution about blindly jumping on a technology for all of the wrong reasons, which again, isn't Lego's fault if you do. Now, Lego Dacta, or this Lego Dacta controller, which I'm showing here, this was actually released back in the early 1990s. But you may be surprised to know that the original Lego robotics kits were not designed for children. They were actually designed for engineering students at MIT so that they could rapid prototype ideas in the lab. And the first time that I used one of these Lego Dacta controllers was in the R&D lab at Queen's University, the Faculty of Engineering, back in the early 90s. Now, fast forward to present day, we now have Lego Spike being sold to school in droves to support programming and robotics programs in the lower years. Now, this product is great because it has a low point of entry in the sense that you can play with it just like a toy. But there's so much potential in what you could do with it as well. And this toy-like interface and gamification of programming has become the cornerstone of a lot of STEM programs, especially as STEM pushes further and further into the younger year groups. And there was kind of a comment in the chat a moment ago about STEM from grade 10s and above, and not that STEM has to start at grade 10, but as you've kind of seen a lot of the comments that I'm making, I do recommend STEM definitely at the higher age levels for a lot of reasons. And I'll get to that later on. Definitely we can do some Q&A at the end, but I just kind of wanted to address that now. But we do see STEM pushing further and further into the younger year groups. And there's nothing saying that that shouldn't happen, but there's also things that we need to consider when that happens as well. Now, kind of moving back onto what I wanted to talk about. Now, with Lego, it did really popularize programming, particularly in the younger years. And while programming is important, it has begun to dominate the focus of most STEM programs. And this has actually been to the expense of all other critical sectors to our economy. Now, because Lego did such a good job of simplifying coding, while also providing a tactile learning resource, the idea that students could learn logic and abstraction from a young age really took hold in international education. For example, England went on to become the first country in the European Union to mandate computer science classes for all children between the ages of 5 and 16. And if you read through their national curriculum, you'll probably be amazed by the learning statements that are indicated in this document. Now, for anyone who's unfamiliar with the British system, key stages 1 and 2 are equivalent to grades 1 and 2 in the United States. Now, this document goes on to state the following: high quality computing education, information and computation, abstraction, logic, and algorithms, analyze computational terms. So we're indicating that children that are only 5 to 7 years of age should be able to learn concepts such as abstraction and logic, as well as computational algorithms. And that's pretty impressive because my first year university program course didn't even get into all of these issues. So there's a real disconnect here. And another thing that we need to consider is that the teachers in primary are generalists. So you have this notion of asking a teacher with limited to no experience in programming to teach advanced concepts in programming, which is very unrealistic. And there was also a comment about, how do we teach chemistry in STEM when we're not chemistry teachers? And same idea. You try to have a generalist teach these types of concepts, and they're not going to be able to get those rigorous academic standards, which STEM was supposed to have in the first place. And again, that's something we can definitely kind of bring up in the Q&A in just a moment. So back to the presentation. So England is not alone in this. And in 2016, Finland also introduced programming into their national curriculum. However, Finland did identify the following in their initial action plan. Due to the varied skill levels of Finnish teachers and their ability to teach the basics, the Finnish Ministry of Education will be relying on private sector corporations in the initial stages. But this is really concerning to me. They are concerned with teachers' ability to teach the basics. So when teachers are asked to teach concepts when they lack the ability to teach the basics, it's only logical that students would go on to develop a flawed perceptual paradigm of what they're learning. And this is having a negative impact on industry. Now, the appropriate age for teaching programming is widely disputed, so I'm not likely going to win that argument. But one theory that isn't contested in education is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Now, in Key Stage 1 and 2, we often use a concept called physical pictorial abstract, sometimes also referred to as concrete pictorial abstract. But I have an example here to illustrate the concept if you're unfamiliar with it. At this age, students are still developing their perceptual understanding of the world around them. They may be creative and imaginative, but imagination is not the same as abstract thought. But the key thing here is that students at this age are developing some level of abstraction as they move from physical objects to abstract representations in things like number systems. But this is very different than what abstraction means in computer science and programming. Moreover, in grade 2 through 5, students are still using tactile math blocks that you see here. These are the ones, tens, hundreds, and thousand blocks. While smaller values are typically used in the lower levels, these examples that I've provided here is more typical of a grade 5 curriculum. But as you can see, the students still wouldn't have learned concepts such as order of operations, algebra, Boolean operations, and logic, which are all precursors to learning computer science if we're going to be looking at concepts such as abstraction, logic, and computational algorithms in an authentic way, which wouldn't start happening until stage 4 in the child's teenage years. So the only way that we can push such advanced concepts into such a young age group is to continually simplify and gamify a complex idea to the point of completely misrepresenting the true nature of that concept in the first place. Now, to illustrate the naivety of this decision, I turned to this UK article that was published by eFinancial Careers, How Computer Programming Became the Worst Choice of Career. But if one news article is not enough to illustrate a possible disconnect with our perceptions versus reality in education, let's look at some key economic indicators. Here's a list of all of the Fortune 500 companies in England. Now, despite being the first country to introduce a national curriculum that required students to learn computer science and programming, we do not see a single company in artificial intelligence, hardware, or computer engineering, or software development in the Fortune 500 company list. And when we look at critical skill sectors in the shortages in the UK, we also see that electrical, computer, and software engineering are all top of the list. And there's so many other sectors listed as well, which I talked about earlier in this presentation when discussing the different types of careers in STEM that are at the beginning of my presentation. So let's look at how these critical skill shortages affect the economy. Well, as this report shows, the UK has serious skill shortages in sectors that are critical to the economy, such as engineering. And this has made the UK dependent on foreign expertise in technologies, specifically in telecommunication infrastructure and network engineering. And due to the current geopolitical situation, many MPs perceive that there's an imminent threat to England's national security. Whether or not such a threat really exists is another issue completely, but there's enough of a perception to urge the government to end all contracts with leading telecom giant Huawei. But what does this decision mean for British customers? Well, they'll be left paying for a multi-million-dollar network overhaul that will see the delay of 5G services nationwide. In layman's terms, they will pay more money to have an inferior service for a number of years while they catch up to the rest of the world. And this will adversely affect businesses as they have to try to compete with the rest of the world using older and slower network technologies while paying more money to access these services in the first place. So as you can see, the failure to meet the needs of these critical sectors does have a direct effect on the economy, national security, and our national sovereignty. So how is it that a country which was the first to introduce a national computer science curriculum be lagging so far behind other countries that don't even have a computer science offering in their curriculum? Well, remember that story I told you where a Fortune 500 company did not want to hire graduates with relevant degrees because they had often developed a flawed operational paradigm? Well, that's what we're seeing here. In order to teach programming to all students, regardless of their aptitude or interest in programming, companies needed to resort to simplification and gamification of programming skills, which has resulted in the true nature of programming being misrepresented to an entire generation of students. So I want to go back to this quote from the Finnish Ministry of Education. Due to the varied skill levels of Finnish teachers and their ability to teach the basics, they know that their teachers do not have the skills needed to teach programming properly. So they're going to rely on corporations to create ready-made solutions that would allow the average teacher to be able to teach programming without having the prior knowledge, learning it, or experience necessary. So let me show you what one of these solutions look like in practice. This is actually a video that was given to me by an experienced computer science teacher. And as you can see, they just clicked on the insert button and the code just magically populated the relevant areas. Now, as a teacher or administrator who knows nothing about programming, it would be easy to walk into this classroom and be impressed by what's happening. But in all honesty, all we've done is to completely misrepresent the true nature of programming. And that would encourage the wrong students to pursue programming for all of the wrong reasons. And in reality, what we've actually done is to create a flawed perceptual paradigm of what programming is. And that could be detrimental to the students' future success in the field of computer science. But let me further support this notion with some research. So here's a key takeaway from a research study from the Rochester Institute of Technology. They indicated that teachers face several challenges when presenting the fundamental concepts of programming in the classroom. The research study also found that students who learned programming using a block-based programming environment had a higher probability of producing syntax errors in authentic test-based programming environments. And as you can see by this chart, the discrepancy is staggering. So again, I'm just going to reiterate this. Students who learned programming using a block-based environment had a higher probability of producing errors. And you can see how much by that orange line, how much the increase in errors were. And this is actually very concerning because when we look at a lot of these programming environments that are being pushed into the younger grades, they're all block-based programming environments. And another study from Northwestern University had similar findings, indicating that students generally found that block-based programming to be easier, but the students went on to identify issues of authenticity. Now, when we think about the original mandates of STEM to create rigorous academic programs to compete in the new economy, the very notion of our instruction methods lacking authenticity seems questionable to me. Now, please don't get me wrong, programming is incredibly important. And I actually started my career in the programming field, but it's also an incredibly difficult subject area to teach well. Now, what I'm implying here is that programming really needs to be done by a professional who knows what they're doing and talking about. And it needs to be done at a point in time where students have the cognitive ability to properly engage with abstract concepts such as logic and computation. And we also need to make sure that we're not misrepresenting the true nature of programming either. For instance, the gamification and simplification of programming to make it more accessible has created a seriously flawed perception of what programming is all about. So what happens when students don't take programming seriously and their programs are riddled with syntax errors, as we saw in these research studies? What happens when there are syntax errors that make it into our traffic light control systems, the national power grid, or in a life support system? Or what about these examples of a software glitch in the Boeing 737, which resulted in 2 plane crashes in less than a year, killing all passengers on board? And I can go on to cite numerous examples from around the world where hundreds of people have died as a result of faulty programming. And this really illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. There's nothing wrong with teaching programming, but it's important that programming is taught by a qualified professional and at a point where the learner has developed the necessary cognitive thought process to be able to interact with the content in a meaningful way. And this is so that they can authentically engage with real-world programming skills. So if it isn't STEM, then what is it? So let's take a look at these 3 projects for a moment. Let's start with the first one, which is a science diorama. Now, it doesn't solve a real-world problem, and it doesn't lead innovation. While this project is somewhat cross-curricular, the art is peripheral to the development of our understanding of the solar system. Furthermore, this project does not address a legitimate need but really addresses a desire to make a fun and engaging project. Great, that's perfectly valid, but it's not STEM by definition. This is actually a prime example of project-based learning, which is an excellent approach to teaching and learning that any teacher could incorporate into their classroom practices, regardless of what subject they teach. They don't need to be a STEM teacher to use project-based learning. And in reality, we should really see project-based learning being incorporated into all of our subjects, math, science, English, etc. Next is Lego, which I personally love, while also being somewhat critical of its overuse in school. Now, if we consider Piaget theory of cognitive development, this kind of kinesthetic activity is excellent for the development of concrete operational skills between the ages of 7 to 11 years old. And again, this isn't STEM though. This is representative of play and learn, which is a perfectly valid framework and is critical for this stage of cognitive development in children. And finally, the robot. Of course, we're all thinking that this is STEM because the students made a robot. But did they really? They could have made anything here. A fairy princess, a superhero, or an animal friend. This is just arts and crafts. And this is one thing that's happening a lot now, as schools are trying to make K through 12 STEM programs without really understanding the true nature of STEM. Perfectly valid teaching pedagogies are being swallowed up by the STEM craze. But this kind of flawed misrepresentation of STEM is only contributes to us moving further and further away from our original objectives with STEM education, which was to create rigorous academic programs that promoted the real-world application of science, technology, engineering, math skills, which would prepare students for the new economy. And that brings me back to my example about coffee at the start of this presentation. People's perceptions are often very different from reality. Now, I'm sure everyone is aware of these kind of memes that are related to expectations versus reality. And again, I'm going to come back to this notion that STEM was created in response to national studies that indicated that America was falling further behind other nations in critical sectors to the economy. Now, while the VTE programs of the 1970s through 90s benefited from collaboration between governments, industry leaders, and educators alike, the STEM movement of the 21st century didn't have this galvanizing catalyst to drive educational reforms. But now, 20 years later, with the evolution of STEM into STEAM and the widespread adoption of these programs in most schools, what do the numbers actually look like after 20 years of development? Well, unfortunately, things didn't really turn out the way that we wanted. Look at America there, the nation that was once the world leader, the country that invented STEM education to advance the development of critical skills that were critical to the economy. And yet they're still falling even further behind key educational metrics. And why is that? Because teachers were never properly supported in the early days of STEM education. And this led to confusion and disarray with the development of STEM programs worldwide. And we can see the long-term results clearly if we take the time to look. But what about Canada there? They're the top of the list for all English-speaking countries. So what are they doing that's different than every other nation? Well, Canada is one of the few nations that has a vocational to teacher education track, which will allow industry professionals to become qualified teachers. But not only is this program track available, it's actually a requirement for teachers going in to teach any of the high-skilled technologies such as electrical, computer, and mechanical engineering. So teachers who are teaching these rigorous academic programs that are designed to prepare students for the new global economy are actually former industry professionals. And these professionals would have invaluable experiences that they could bring to the educational sector that would help them design authentic real-world lessons that apply science, technology, engineering, mathematics in an appropriate context. And here we can see those key words keep popping up that we've been talking about from the original mission statement of STEM education. They keep popping up again and again.
Yes, really a very, very in-depth analysis of the STEM framework. My question will be now, to make sure that schools do not face those tough challenges, can you propose a roadmap that tackles and overcomes all those physical, intellectual, and financial challenges?
So far I've talked a lot about ideas that would be germane to educators, but not much specifically directed towards administrators who are probably interested in learning more about program management. Now, the key thing that I can recommend here is that you take the time to question your own decisions, to be critical thinkers that delve deeper into your own decision-making process, so that you can constantly evaluate the integrity of your own decision-making process. Now, this doesn't mean that you should second-guess all your decisions or that the decisions that you've been making are wrong. What it means is that you need to make sure that you're not making decisions based on preconceptions that will only maintain the business as usual mindset. Instead, you need to push yourself to make rational decisions that are based on facts. And this is very difficult for us to do as we're not wired this way. We're a species that's governed by our emotions and not by logic. And as we've seen, even CEOs of some of the world's largest companies struggle to overcome this challenge. Therefore, leaders need to take a step back so they can critically reflect upon their own ideas and make sure that their corporate actions align with their corporate vision and mission statements. And this is an idea that's at the heart of what the best business schools in the world are trying to teach their MBA graduates. However, there's no right or wrong answer here, only a mindset of critically evaluating the very essence of the decisions that you're making to ensure that your actions truly uphold your ideas, vision, and corporate mission. So remember when I introduced the idea that most people's perceptions of what they think they want compared to what they actually want being two very disassociated concepts? And this is particularly true for parents and administrators in regard to STEM education. Well, let me illustrate this point. Here in China, parents want the best for their children, and they want holistic education, and they don't want their child to go through the mass hysteria of an exam-based system such as the Chinese Gaokao. But what is the first thing that these parents do after pulling their child out of a rigorous exam-based system? They typically enroll their child in either an IGCSE courses, which is just another exam-based system, or they get their child to take as many AP courses as possible, which again is an exam-based system. And this example really illustrates how parents' perceptions of what they want and the reality of what they want for their children being two totally different things. They often think that they want a holistic approach to education, but in reality, they just swap one exam-based system for another. And they pay a lot of money for this, so they do expect results. Now, moving on, the average cost of private education in China is now in excess of 20,000 US dollars per year, which is a lot of money. And in Shanghai, that average is now over 40,000 US dollars a year. And this sheds some lights on the recent policy changes here in China to crack down on private education. But the key takeaway here is that there's a lot of money to be made in private education, and parents want to get their money's worth. Now, because of the expectations of the parents, which is phenomenally high, coupled with the cost of tuition and the level of competition being unprecedented, school administrators want programs that can sell. So they typically want to see highly marketable programs that show inclusive activities where students are engaged in holistic hands-on learning. And as we saw in some of these examples, we had inclusive hands-on activities being done, but many of them were not holistic and they failed to meet the appropriate learning outcomes. And that brings me back to another key point. There's a difference between showing and doing. And while it's easy to show people that we're doing STEM education, it's very difficult to do it well. And this brings us to these two ideologies for STEM education that administrators are constantly grappling with. They think they want inclusive programs that are engaging and fun, but they also want to give the parents exactly what they want, which is a rigorous academic program that will improve test scores. And we find these two ideas are often incompatible with each other, and they create a phenomenon known as academic culture shock. Now, with culture shock, we always start with the honeymoon phase, and this is where schools always start. There's a lot of excitement around launching a new STEM program, and there's a lot of money being spent. But that's followed by the rejection phase, where schools are expected to see a positive return on their investment, but many may be disappointed with the results that they're getting. When their multi-million-dollar investment turns into this, a bunch of glorified art projects coupled with an unmarketable junk pile. And this brings us to the regression phase, where school administrators grapple with the idea of what to do next. And one of two things will happen here. Ideally, all of the responsible parties will sit down, identify the problem, and develop a strategic action plan that takes into consideration what the school can feasibly do with their resources, while also developing an action plan that is aligned to the school's vision and objectives. Alternatively, emotions come into play, and this often leads to bad financial decisions as we try to continue to support the mistakes that we've already made in the past. At this point, we get trapped by emotional attachments to bad investments, which represents a number of sunk costs. And this results in decisions that will only result in the program continually draining financial resources and eventually go on to fail. And this brings me to a conversation I had with a teacher last year who was very distraught with what was happening at their school, as they were hired as a STEM and makerspace teacher. But the school had gone through such an emotional roller coaster with their past implementation strategy that the principals never wanted to hear the word STEM uttered in their school ever again. And this kind of backlash against STEM education is starting to grow as more and more schools enter the rejection phase due to bad implementation plans. And this could have serious impacts on the future of STEM education if we don't start taking immediate action to solve these problems. So how does this situation come to pass? Well, school administrators often invest in equipment and facilities to create a need, rather than starting with the development of a curriculum and then making strategic purchases to support the desired learning outcomes of that curriculum. And they do this because they want to get the program up and running as quickly as possible. And to help them in this generally they turn to generic purchasing guides, which are typically used in these situations. But this approach is very naive because these purchasing guides do not take into consideration limiting factors such as the amount of space the school has, the finances available to run the program, the number of students which can be enrolled, or the expertise of the teachers who will eventually teach these programs. Moreover, most of these purchasing guides are actually published by the very companies that sell the equipment. And they don't really care about the internal development of the curriculum at the school. They only care about selling as much equipment as they can. Next, teachers are brought in and are to teach these programs, and they often complain that they don't have the appropriate materials that are needed to make the necessary connection to the curriculum. As a result, project development often resorts to the lowest common denominator, which is typically the development of glorified arts and craft projects. And finally, this results in a compromised program development and a growing level of frustration between parents, teachers, and administrators. Now, let's look at some examples of misaligned equipment purchases that resulted from using these Easy Start guides for STEM education. So in this example, the school spends thousands of dollars on equipment which they believe represents STEM education. And they thought this would provide authentic hands-on learning experiences, which would support what parents wanted from a premium private education. So here we have a class set of top development of rigorous academic standards that will get the child into a top university. After all, this is typically why parents are willing to pay such high premiums for private education. Now, in this example, the school would start teaching skills for a general labor market. And this is because they naively think that hands-on learning is the same STEM education. But this kind of skill set is misaligned with what the parents are expecting for their child's future. As a result, parents are likely to become displeased that their child is not being given the rigorous academic program that they've paid for. Now, let me put the parents' concerns into a suitable context for you. Now, the average wage for a seamstress is $12.94 US an hour, which is just above the poverty line. And in developing countries, it's less than $2 a day. But private schools are charging $40,000 US a year in Shanghai now. Therefore, the parents that are spending this kind of money on private education are expecting rigorous academic programs that will help get their child into the best universities possible and for their child to go on to get high-paying jobs. And they're not typically going to invest thousands of dollars in their child's education to learn skills for a general labor market unless there's a really good reason for it. And that raises another really good point. Not all schools need to focus on getting every student into universities like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Oxford. There is a need for some schools to serve market niches. And we can see this with some private charter schools in the United States. But serving a niche market needs to be part of your strategic vision and educational philosophy, and not an accidental afterthought, as was the case here. And let me just state before moving on that there's nothing wrong with having sewing lessons in school. I myself had to take a mandatory life skill class when I was in school in Japan. In this class, we learned how to drink tea properly with respect, manage our personal finances, how to cook basic meals, and yes, we also learned how to sew. But we learned how to sew a button on our shirts or repair a ripped seam on our pant leg, which cost almost nothing to do if we use a needle and thread, and actually has real-world applications. But this wasn't by any means called STEM education. This was called life skills. And the skills that we learned here were not to prepare us to go into an unskilled labor market, but to help us learn practical skills that we would likely use in everyday life, regardless of what profession we all went into. And the Chinese have recently just announced changes to their education system that will see all children receive life skill classes as part of their public education system as they start reforming the K-9 public education system here in China. So the last point I have time to make in this regard is value-added services. And I'd like you to keep that in mind. What might be considered a wise decision for one school may not be considered acceptable for another. And this is practically true for public institutions, which offer free education versus private institutions that come at a hefty price tag. Now, let me give you an example. As we saw with the Finnish Ministry of Education, they were concerned about teachers' ability to teach basics. Now, if the Finnish government paid for an interactive programming subscription for use in a free public school, then however, if a private school, which charges $40,000 a year, does the exact same thing, the parents will probably be outraged. And that's because the parents could have just bought that subscription for themselves for less money than what they're paying for their child to go to that premium private school. So in this case, the private school hasn't provided any value-added service to the parents that would justify the high cost of tuition. However, let me provide another example that will illustrate this idea slightly better. Now, most of us love that $4 hamburger from our favorite fast food joint, and it does provide value for money. However, if we were to take that same hamburger and to serve it in a luxurious restaurant, it will still be a $4 hamburger. We haven't added any value to the product or service. And this is a real example from a few years ago that drew a lot of attention. However, it's by no means a sustainable business model. And that is one thing that you need to think about when developing specialty programs for your school. Are you creating value for money? Because if you're not, then your business model will not be sustainable in the long run. Therefore, let me reiterate this point. What's appropriate for a free public school may not be acceptable for an expensive private school if you're not adding value to the product or services that you're offering your clients. They will expect to get their money's worth. Therefore, you'll need to make complex decisions that go way beyond educational management and into the realms of business management. And only then will you be able to strike a balance, the balance which is needed to create business plans that are strategic in nature that also uphold your educational philosophy and objectives.
Great, great. Thank you very much. And my last question is a conclusion. Then we can get questions. In conclusion, we need to make sure that schools, educators, parents, and public authorities are integrating the essence called STEM education within the 21st century lifelong learning education. And all of us are thankful today for your fruitful presentation of the pillars to establish the essence of the 21st century education called STEM education. As a finale, can you please summarize for us today's framework in the form of a list of recommendations for all related stakeholders, from teachers, facilitators, education authorities, education administrators, to make sure that our complex adaptive systems called schools can be suitable for today and tomorrow, using STEM education as one of the most potent catalyzers of the 21st century education?
Yeah, so I spent a total of 6 years doing my MBA program. And during this time, I focused my studies on the development of STEM education here in China. But a lot of these ideas would be applicable to other parts in the world as well. And part of the reason why I spent so long on my master's degree was so I could work with as many schools as possible, which would allow me to gather more data and validate my ideas over an extended period of time. Therefore, before we conclude today's presentation, I wanted to share with you a few takeaways from my dissertation. Now, ironically, a lot of the ideas in this list will seem like common sense. However, I'm sure that you're well aware of the saying, common sense isn't all that common. So let's start with recommendations that would be implemented by the Ministry of Education. So number one, continue reviewing foreign research on the development of STEM education teaching pedagogies while conducting internal research studies into the ongoing development of domestic STEM programs. Develop more teacher training programs for local teachers to address immediate teacher shortages. Create VTE or industry to STEM teacher pathways to address interim teacher shortages. And this is something that we saw is happening in Canada. And as the PISA results show, they must be doing something right. Develop concurrent teacher training programs to address long-term demand for highly qualified teaching professionals. Encourage local STEM teachers to conduct and publish research into the ongoing development of STEM programs within their own country. And this is actually a requirement for all Chinese teachers. And I think this is a valuable strategy to ensure continued professional development of teachers, particularly in demanding sectors such as STEM education. Strategically rotate teachers and principals to advance STEM programs and development. And again, this is a strategy that the Chinese government has put into place to help ensure the development of high quality STEM programs nationwide. And finally, to start promoting the development and sharing of STEM curriculum amongst local schools. The next set of recommendations are for administrators. Number one, it's important for administrators to work with STEM teachers during the early stages of a program's development. Now, although this sounds obvious, it doesn't happen that often, particularly at private schools, as administrators typically start with a mass investment to start the program before actually bringing in an educator to teach the program. Promote a unified school-wide understanding of STEM education to emphasize its future role in the school and nation's educational strategy. And this is incredibly important, and yet it hardly ever happens. Offer brief in-service programs to provide accurate information about STEM programs and to help dispel any misconceptions that may form otherwise. Again, reaching out to community partners can have a huge impact on teaching and learning. However, we don't see this happening much anymore, which is very unfortunate because we saw the benefits that collaboration had for the VTE programs of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Learn from the school STEM teachers and try reaching out to local community partners, which can offer additional guidance and insights. And finally, try sharing best practices with other schools via curriculum sharing, publishing of research papers, or through teacher and principal rotation programs. And this is something that the Ministry of Education in China is trying to encourage through the introduction of the new educational policies. However, it can be difficult to encourage private schools to engage in this form of collaboration when they're in direct competition for one another. Next are recommendations for purchasing departments. So number one, avoid making uninformed purchasing decisions. And again, this seems incredibly obvious, but most purchasing decisions are made by finance departments that do not understand the details of the purchase. And this often leads to a lot of bad purchasing decisions being made. Work with STEM teachers to make relevant equipment purchases, make purchases that support the strategic learning outcomes. And as we saw, many schools rely on easy start guides to build a program, and this only results in buying equipment and then trying to make a need for it. However, quality programs will start with the desired learning outcomes, and then we'll look at making strategic purchases that will support those learning outcomes. Look at making complementary equipment purchases. Work with teachers and IT departments to avoid compatibility issues or develop support strategies to aid in the successful implementation of new technologies. And compatibility issues is something that I see all the time. And part of this results from uninformed purchasing decisions being made. Let me give you a prime example. Many schools are implementing a one-to-one or bring your own device program for computers for all their students. And these programs are often centered around the school-wide use or adoption of Apple computers. However, equipment that is only compatible with Windows computers is then bought for use in the STEM lab or in their makerspace. And again, it seems obvious, and yet this is happening in most of the schools that I've worked with over the past 10 years. And number six, avoid proprietary equipment architectures, or if this kind of equipment investment is necessary, invest heavily into one system architecture only to avoid unnecessary diversification into similar yet incompatible ecosystems. And the last section is all about recommendations that teachers can use. So number one, work with school administrators to develop an educational plan for the STEM program to develop that focuses on the development, educational expectations and teachers' needs. Determine the number of courses being offered, how many sections of each course will be run, and how many students can safely or viably attend each class section. Determine what equipment will be needed to offer the proposed program and compare this to the funds available for the equipment and material purchases. Identify if an asynchronous learning approach is needed to maximize the use of equipment purchases, or if programs with a fixed chronological order will provide better learning outcomes. Set key learning objectives for the course and make strategic purchasing decisions that support those learning outcomes. Spread out the purchase over the course of several years while constantly reassessing the curriculum objectives, and then adjust your purchasing decisions accordingly. And make additional purchases that complement the pre-existing purchasing strategies to strengthen the learning outcomes of the existing program. So throughout this presentation, I've spent a lot of time analyzing problems related to the various STEM programs. And I've also provided you with several examples of how we can create rigorous academic connections that place science, technology, engineering, and mathematics into a real-world lessons that provide authentic learning opportunities. However, due to time constraints, I've only been able to illustrate several possible scenarios of how to address evident shortcomings in the execution of STEM projects and curricula. And while accurately identifying the nature of these problems is important, it's still only the first step in fixing the problem. So if you did find this webinar enlightening, you may also want to consider these other presentations that are related to the development of high quality STEM programs, which we'll be releasing later on in the year. And I hope that in our next presentation, which is developing a sustainable STEM program, and I'll get John to share the synopsis for you in the chat in just a moment, we'll really go into strategies to develop cost-effective programs that focus on learning outcomes rather than necessarily being distracted by technological fads. So after all, these presentations will be equally as informative as this one and will provide you with evidence-based examples and project modeling that will help you design STEM programs that will help prepare your students for the new global economy. And again, all of these presentations will be free of charge. And the upcoming presentations, a lot of them also are coupled with a number of free resources that we'll be sharing with you as part of our educational philanthropy projects to try to help develop and support teachers, particularly in China. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. There's no future in STEM and what we can do to fix the problem. I really hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. And as always, if you like what you saw and want to learn more about developing sustainable STEM programs, please make sure that you review the other presentations that are part of this web series. So in closing, I would like to say thank you, and I would like to wish you all the best. And we have a lot of questions that have been popping up in the chat. So let me let John now kind of go through and summarize, and then we can review them.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Campbell. It was an outstanding webinar, really detailed, a very in-depth analysis. And as you said, if we had more time, we could go more in-depth, but already it was too much in-depth, and it was very fruitful for all our educators. We were honored to have you today. We were honored to have all those educators, all our colleagues from all over the world. Thank you very much. And thank you, Huan Quan Village, for always being here, for always being this educational hub, helping and assisting all teachers, all facilitators, all schools, and assisting the Secretary of Education with great pillars of education like Mr. Scott Andrew Campbell. Thank you, Mr. Campbell.